Okay.
Mr. Moyane makes allegations.
Chair, I'm on the
racist.
floor. Really, I can't stand this.
Okay,
This cannot
okay,
be happening for
okay.
the third time.
Mr.
Ms.
Mr.
Leroux
Mpofu,
must shut up when I'm
Mr.
speaking.
Mpofu, let me
Okay?
just hear before. Must you just hear?
You too, Mr. Koda.
Mr.
So,
Mpofu, just sit
I'm
down.
still
Let
on
me hear her first.
the floor. You also shut up.
No, Mr. Mpofu, I'm in charge here. Please sit down.
That was well-known advocate Dali Mpofu telling fellow advocate Michelle Leroux and the late former cabinet minister Pravin Gordhan to shut up at the State Capture Commission back in 2021. Now, although the Legal Practice Council later ruled that this comment was not disrespectful, the LPC has now consolidated many other instances where Mpofu may have crossed the legal line to be ventilated in a misconduct inquiry in Pretoria later this month.
You've essentially got charges that relate to a former public protector, a former SARS official, and 5 judges who were all, in some way or another,
Senior judges
in different ways, fundamentally disrespected by advocate Dali Mpofu. And I think that it is very important that there is accountability for that and that he answers to that.
That conversation with my colleague, specialist legal journalist Karyn Maughan, next. And later in the show, Trump's tariffs are now on pause for Mzansi, and the Springboks number 8 is injured playing abroad.
To stay tuned to The Lead for every edition, hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels.
My name's Graeme Raubenheimer. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. The Legal Practice Council, it's a national body meant to hold the legal profession to account, is launching a full-scale disciplinary inquiry against well-known advocate Dali Mpofu, scheduled to begin later this month. Among the slew of misconduct charges the advocate faces related to comments that he had made during several legal matters, including the inquiry into the former Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane's fitness to hold office. Now, to detail these more closely, Karyn Maughan, our specialist legal writer, joins me now from our Johannesburg studios. Karyn, so lovely to chat again. How are you doing today?
I'm excellent. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Of course, you are super busy with all various high-profile cases at the moment. And here the news comes that the Legal Practice Council, the LPC, has finally, after some 2.5 years, brought, as I understand it, some 7 counts of misconduct charges against advocate Mpofu. Previously, we know that the LPC had cleared Mpofu for the time that he had told an evidence leader and fellow advocate Michelle Leroux, as well as the late former cabinet minister Pravin Gordhan, to shut up, quote unquote, at the State Capture Commission. I remember detailing that at the time. It was quite shocking. And then he was cleared of that. Now, though, there's these 7 misconduct counts. And I thought it would be interesting to detail the context in which they're found, starting with the inquiry into the former public protector presided by Kobudile Tianchi in Parliament. So, Karyn, remind our listeners about that heated exchange between Mpofu and Tianchi in late 2022. Of course, Mpofu was representing Mkhwebane at the time.
That context is very important. We see that quite a significant number of the charges against advocate Mpofu relate from the Mkhwebane inquiry. There was a heated exchange between the chairperson of the inquiry and advocate Mpofu, in which, advocate Mpofu actually admitted that he was threatening the chair. He'd said to him, it's not a threat, it's a promise, and you will pay one day. That was the initial comment. And Dianti said to him, is that a threat? And he said subsequent to that, no, it's not a threat, it's a promise. Obviously, in the wake of that, Dianti was understandably aggrieved and sort of had called on the LPC, the Legal Practice Council, to do some kind of investigation. But, as I also detailed in my book, seemed to be a massive reluctance to take that matter on. And in addition to that, of course, Graeme, there was also the serious, I think, evident misconduct of Dali Mpofu's questioning of former Public Protector Thuli Madonsela, where, in amongst, he amongst other things, falsely accused her of criminality because of the way her affidavits were commissioned. And again, we saw this recurrent pathology in much of the litigation that he embarked on, where he would elevate banal aspects of the law and in my particular case, obviously reporting on a court case, to the status of criminality, and then mechanize that in order to undermine whoever his particular adversary was. And in that particular instance, it was Advocate Thuli Madonsela. He said also raised questions about whether she was an advocate, wanted to revisit all the insults that she had faced when she was doing the Nkandla report, which he, ironically enough, had defended in court for the UDM at the time, when he was still very much part of the EFF, the leadership of the EFF, and a council who would routinely take on these kind of so-called state capture cases and fight for Madonsela. Now, in that context, turning on her and essentially asking her to revisit the worst of the worst insults that she'd experienced, including about her appearance. We also know that he's facing charges of going after a witness, as he did with Madonsela, knowing full well, or seeking to impugn or discredit a witness, knowing full well that there was no real basis to do so, doing so with former SARS officials, Johan van Lochenberg, who of course was called to testify about the so-called SARS rogue unit report in the Mkhwebane inquiry, and then faces questions about his mental health condition in circumstances where that was manifestly inappropriate. And arguably, I would say, really as a legal professional in South Africa's environment, to bring up someone's chronic mental health condition as the LPC alleges a mechanism to discredit and undermine him is manifestly inappropriate.
In regards to at least two of those, let's call them incidents, with Jantjie as well as Van Lochenberg, you've received reaction from them in your latest piece, which is currently trending, by the way. Your day will come, quote, Mpofu once warned Jantjie, and it has, but it's now come from Mpofu. That story currently on the front page of News 24. You've gotten the reaction from both Van Lochenberg as well as Jantjie in relation to the LPC now going ahead with the consolidation of these misconduct charges into the full inquiry. What are their responses at this time, Karyn?
I think both of them are just fundamentally relieved that there has finally been some form of accountability. Neither of them is pushing or saying, he should be struck from the role. All they're saying is that he should be held accountable for his conduct. I mean, Graeme, the other charges which are not related to, the Mkhwebane inquiry also include his conduct in the Judicial Service Commission. Where, he was a representative of Advocates for Transformation, put in a very powerful position, the employment, the appointment of judges in South Africa. We know how important that role is. We know what courts have done to hold the line against state capture, corruption, other bad decisions by our government, including in terms of ARVs, in the Mbeki administration, et cetera, and in that position, and I think this is actually one of the most serious charges that he faces, he says to the Gauteng judge, President Dunstan Mlambo, he raises manifestly baseless allegations that he's been sexually harassing female judges. And, in circumstances where, against all JSE protocols, no formal complaint was lodged by anyone. There was simply no evidence that was in fact true. And, I think what's going to be fascinating for me in this inquiry is Advocate Mpofu is going to have to explain why he did that in the absence of any real evidence, and reveal to the LPC and to the country, because the hearings are public, what exactly transpired there. The other accusation against him, emanating from the JSE, of course, is his comment to then Chief Justice nominee and now current Chief Justice Mandisa Meyer, that they had spent nights together, which was a reference to all-night study sessions that they had, participated in as students. But
sexual innuendo, if you will.
Sexual innuendo, exactly. That's what the LPC is saying. And they're saying that's unconstitutional. How in those hearings, Advocate Mpofu was constantly emphasizing the need for, a female presence on the bench, as part of a transformational imperative. Mandisa Meyer now is the Chief Justice of the country. But in that context, when she was essentially competing against 3 other male judges, to make a sexual comment like that against a woman who was at that stage the Supreme Court of Appeal president, any woman, but especially a woman who's fought, kicked, and clawed her way into a leadership position in the judiciary against tremendous odds, to make such a comment is completely unacceptable. And again, he will have to explain that. And of course, the final charge against him relates to his conduct in the Old Mutual former CEO, Peter Moyo, his long-running litigation against Old Mutual, where the LPC is essentially saying he was behind a letter that was sent to 3 judges who were ruling on a case in relation to that long-running dispute, where he, according to the LPC, was responsible for almost chastising and reprimanding those judges for asking for further clarification on arguments that had been made in court in a highly inappropriate and disrespectful manner, to the point, Graeme, that they actually in their judgment replicated that entire letter, put it in the judgment and said the LPC needs to investigate, and listed the charges that they believed the LPC should investigate him on in relation to that particular conduct. So when one thinks about it, you've essentially got charges that, relate to a former public protector, a former SARS official, and 5 judges, who were all in some way or another
senior judges in
different ways, fundamentally disrespected by Advocate Dali Mpofu. And I think that it is very important that there is accountability for that, and that he answers to that. And he explains why, for the love of all that is sacred, he thought that behavior was appropriate.
This consolidated inquiry that's now taken 2.5 years for the LPC to essentially put together and put all these incidents into sort of one charge sheet, if you will, happening on the 30th of April. Do we know where it's going to be held, Karyn? And, what is the legally binding powers of the LPC at the end of the day? What could they ultimately come up with in terms of some sort of final measure against the advocate? Are their powers that legally binding, or is it perhaps something that will only end up being a recommendation of sorts?
No, the LPC has a lot of power. Essentially what they're doing is that they're finding out, is he guilty of this misconduct? And if he's guilty, what are the appropriate sanctions? One of the most serious sanction is that they apply to the High Court to have him struck from the role of advocate. And he is thereby prohibited from practicing. And obviously that's the most serious, and I think understandably he will do everything in his power to argue against that. But I think the fact that they have consolidated all the charges in this way may suggest to me that they learned something from the previous LPC decision regarding that shut up incident in the state capture inquiry, where it was this absolutely bizarre situation where you saw the then Deputy Chief Justice of the country, subsequently Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, condemning Dali Mpofu for that behavior and saying this is not appropriate. It is not appropriate for legal practitioners to tell people to shut up in a hearing. I do not accept it, and I condemn it in the strongest possible terms. In response to that, Advocate Mpofu then writes this very antagonistic tweet, and basically, as he has done in the past, alleges some kind of racist agenda against him, and said, I can't remember the exact words of the tweet, but essentially it was a very full of bravado and very antagonistic, not apologizing, not taking responsibility. And in the wake of this, an LPC investigation says, no, Advocate Mpofu is not guilty of any professional misconduct in this matter, because telling someone to shut up in isiXhosa isn't considered rude.
Sure.
Which anyone who if you go and tell anyone to vala umlomo in the Eastern Cape, you must know it's not going to end well for you. So even that was a nonsense explanation. But I think, News 24 and myself reported very extensively on this when we got the minutes for the LPC, when they were discussing this and they were discussing some of these other complaints. It very much appeared that there was a cohort within the LPC that were literally doing everything they could not to investigate Advocate Mpofu and not to hold him accountable, to the point where there was a degree of victim blaming of Advocate Michelle Leroux, which I find absolutely shocking in the context of the misogynistic legal environment that South Africa arguably, is unfortunately characterized by.
Karyn, as an esteemed legal journalist as yourself, you've got many, many years of experience in this. This is your forte. This is your field. You've been closely following it. For me, as a journalist, as a broadcaster that looks at many different themes, my head's all over the show, and sometimes I see a lot of these things in isolation. But for the longest time, I did really feel that Advocate Mpofu was getting away with an awful lot, right?
He was getting away with murder. You can say it like that.
I interviewed him just before the pandemic struck when I went up to Johannesburg to report, and I went to Sandton offices at the time to interview him about his cause at that point. Of course, he had joined the EFF, and he was moving to strip former President F.W. de Klerk of his Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know if you remember that. I went to go and interview the advocate at his offices. It was just him and I in his boardroom in Sandton. And I remember at the time, he was incredibly charming with me. That was the first time I had a one-on-one with him. Very nice person. He even joked with me, why did you leave Cape Town for Johannesburg when it's so lekker to live there? And I left thinking, this guy seems very affable. He's a nice person indeed. And then, of course, you see his conduct in all these various sort of legal instances, and you question what type of person he is. You've had a closer relationship with him, of course, in the past. You had penned this opinion piece just late last year, detailing your level of friendship with the advocate. You even attended his mom's funeral over in the Eastern Cape. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and I also, I worked very closely with his son, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, who, as you know, has a very popular YouTube channel. And yeah, I mean, I'd really genuinely regarded him as a friend, but obviously I think that he was very aggrieved by myself and Jan Kaber's reporting on the Mkhwebane inquiry, where his behavior just degenerated from, one bad comment to another, just constant antagonism, constant animosity, and, really untoward behavior, as I said before, against Yanti, against Madansela, against Van Rochenberg, and actually against a host of witnesses. I think, there could be 20 more charges in relation to the conduct that was experienced at the Mkhwebane inquiry. And I also was very critical of his conduct at the JSC, particularly in regards to what he did to Mlambo. And I took him on about it. And I said, there's simply no evidence. We'd heard similar rumors. I had gone and investigated it thoroughly as a News 24 journalist. And I'd found that the genesis of the story of the Mlambo so-called sexual harassment was the fact that he'd called Besin Kabinde, a retired Concord judge, to assist two female judges whose names I'd been given as being, quote unquote, Mlambo's victims, who had actually made a complaint about another judge. It wasn't Mlambo. Mlambo's only sin, inverted commas, in that context was that he'd asked, a fellow female judge to assist these women. And they, I don't think, ultimately decided not to persist with a formal complaint against the judge at issue. But it was manifestly I knew that the source of that so-called rumor was not true. And I said to him, this is not true. And he said, no, more is going to come out, more will be revealed. And of course it wasn't. And I think that, I'm very sad to see someone that I regarded as a real champion during the Zuma years fighting in court, in the Nkandla cases, in the state of capture cases. He fought for the report to be released at a time when the former president was trying to interdict it. And something has gone radically wrong. And I think part of the problem, sadly, is that no one seemed to have said to him, this is not okay. You can't treat people in this way. You may really believe in the cause of your clients, but to openly accuse a woman that you, Thuli Madansela, who you had invited to potentially be mentored by you as an advocate when she left the public protector position, to then accuse her of not being an advocate when you know that that's not true, you are crossing all kinds of moral and ethical lines here. And I think the saddest for me was, I think there was this one moment where I was sitting in the SCA and he was essentially arguing that myself and Advocate Billy Downer, Zuma's prosecutors, could be compared to child rapists. He'd earlier, many times compared us, the seriousness of our so-called leaking of Jacob Zuma's medical information, which had not actually happened, saying that was as serious as murder, as a crime. And I just thought, it was a very sad moment for me, and it is a very sad moment for me to see what's happening. But in the interests of a functioning democracy and efficient rule of law, this process of accountability should have happened a very long time ago. I'm glad it's happening now, and I hope that it is a transparent, open process that restores the faith in the LPC in the wake of some of its very indefensible decision-making in regards to Advocate Mpofu. One thing I must stress is the LPC is under new leadership now, and I think that has had made a major difference. It's now being led by Advocate Pule Seleka, highly regarded counsel, and I think that to its credit, it has looked at the situation and said, we're not going to continue to defend the indefensible. We are going to take action, and they're doing that, and I think credit for that needs to be given.
Karyn, finally, before we end off, I thought a pertinent question, as you have already alluded to it, the long-standing, when will it ever get to fruition, arms deal trial involving the former president, Jacob Zuma. Of course, Advocate Mpofu has now conceded, if you will, that this private prosecution that he had brought against State Advocate Billy Downer, as well as yourself, for this alleged leaking of the medical report regarding Zuma, that's now done, although apparently certain quote-unquote leaks to journalists will now be raised once the actual trial gets underway. What's your understanding here?
I mean, I think we are expecting another constitutional court appeal in regards to the private prosecution, because the last appeal was really about trying to force the SCA to hear the case. It wasn't a full-throttled appeal to the Constitutional Court. So I think there is a level of expectation from us that they will attempt to appeal again. And of course, now Jacob Zuma and French arms company Thales are asking for their prosecutions to be quashed on the basis of delay. The state is fighting that, but as yet, we don't know when this matter is going to be in court again, because no dates have actually been set for the trial to return. And so, it was supposed to be in court next week, 14th of April. My understanding from the state is that that's not happening, but still tremendous and unfortunate uncertainty over a trial that I think arguably has been very effectively delayed by the very same Stalingrad legal tactics that Advocate Mpofu has been so successful in utilizing.
Do you ever think that this trial will ever get underway? In a short nutshell, in your opinion?
Until we have judges that are serious about pursuing the case in the wake of the Stalingrad condemnation universally by the courts, it won't. We need a judiciary that is not afraid to say this thing needs to run. And until that is happening, it will be delayed forever.
And then lastly, where will the LPC hearing be held? Do you know if it's going to be Joburg, Cape Town, or whereabouts?
Pretoria. It's in Pretoria. It's in the offices in Pretoria from 9:30 on the 30th of April. And News 24 will, of course, be applying to cover it.
And that's our specialist legal journalist, Karyn Maughan. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting to us here on The Lead.
Thank you so much.
To our trending topic now. The Trump administration's now hit pause on the 31% tariffs it slapped on South Africa this week. The US president's agreed that countries like South Africa that are willing to negotiate and not retaliate with tariffs may enjoy this pause. Still, News 24's confirmed that the universal 10% tariff remains. Any South African export that was exempted under the Special AGOA Act is now still subject to a 10% tariff. Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Parks Towns reportedly stated that talks with their US counterparts to normalize and balance the SA-US trade relationship are well underway. In the meantime, Trump's trade war with China is escalating. US duties on China have risen to 125%, with China reacting with an 84% tariff on US imports there. The 31% duties pause continues now for 90 days, but at this rate, sudden changes are not out of the question. Keep it here on The Lead for credible updates. And finally, in your latest sport, the Springboks number 8, Jasper Visser, is back home for neck surgery. That's after being ruled out to play the rest of the Japanese club rugby season. There's doubt Visser, the former Cheetahs and Leicester Tigers star, will be able to bounce back in time to join the Boks for this year's tests, beginning late June. Visser follows former number 8 Alrechlo and prop Trevor Nyakane with long-term injuries. The Boks run of fixtures starts with the Barbarians clash before Italy and Georgia at home in July, the Rugby Championship down under between August and October, and a European tour in November. There's a chance South Africa will take on Japan too, but that's not as confirmed yet.
Are you burnt out from the week that was, but need to stay in the news loop? Every Saturday morning at 6, we release The Weekender, a quirky, in-depth look at South Africa and its people. Chock full of exclusive interviews, food, wine, playlists, and opinions, The Weekender is the ultimate segue into Saturday, right here on News 24.
Well, from Mpofu's mouthy moments to Trump's tariff tiff, this has been a bumper edition and a jam-packed news week for The Lead. We'd love to run through some of your mails to thelead@24.com. We've been checking our inbox, and in response to Tuesday's show on Deputy President Paul Mashatile, Soz Henning wrote to us the following quote: "This man, together with Panyaza Lesufi, will take out Cyril Ramaphosa and then heaven help us. They are evil Alexandria Mafia." 3 exclamation marks, close quote. And then on Monday, Louis wrote to us in response to the ANC T-shirt tender edition with Jeff Wicks, and that mail runs, quote, "Thanks so much for exposing this cruelty to the citizens of this country. Those who are responsible for this greediness and corrupt tenders must rot in jail." 4 exclamation marks and an emoji, close quote. That was that mail there. We'd, of course, love more of your mails, comments, and especially voice notes on The Lead. You can mail thelead@24.com to be heard in our next edition. A reminder to stay tuned to this show for every edition. You've got to hit the follow and subscribe buttons on your Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels. Daily episodes are dropping like clockwork Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Well, my name's Graeme Raubenheimer. So long as there's news, we'll have The Lead.